Hello and welcome to another edition of the Umoja Circle. My name is Keith Smokey Johnson, and alongside me is my Rafiki, or in the Keith Swahili language, friend and co-host, Brother Derek Williams. And I would like to invite you into another discussion that we thought we tried to bring innovative topics. For those of you, first of all, for those of you who are new to the Umoja Circle, we are an African-centered talk show where we correct errors where errors are found and where we introduce facts when we find that so many people are working on fiction when it comes to who we are as people of African descent. There's a lot of people who conceptualize things, who think they know, but do not know, even people that look like us. And we are trying to be a model of possibilities about everything that we talk about or everything that we discuss on this show is based on our research and the histories that we want to express, the fact that we want to express the truth about who we are as a people. And one of those topics are, and I think is near and dear to both of us, is now, I know when you hear this topic, there's going to be a visceral reaction, right, Brother Derek? I think that's going to be something that is...
More than likely.
More than likely. But but bear with us, and we'll explain why we brought this topic out. You'll also find that it's a very interesting and important topic that even fits the 21st century that we're in. The reason that we're having this series of discussions is based on a 6-year study done by a sister, a doctor, social scientist by the name of Dr. Joy DeGruy. And it's based on, that's her right there, brilliant sister. And she focuses her studies, she got a doctorate degree and multiple master's degree. So she knows what she speaks. And I think this study was done in the early 2000s, because the book that we're going to be basing our discussion on is called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Now, when you all see this topic, it sounds pretty familiar, don't it? It's kind of based on the PTSD that a lot of people are dealing with. You might have heard since the Iraq-Iran war, the Afghanistan war, and a lot of our soldiers and sailors and airmen are coming back with these type of traumatic experiences and the kind of symptoms that are devastating to not only them but their family. And what she was saying in that book, that you cannot have 246 years of a trauma, okay, that we call enslavement, then another 100 years of Jim Crow apartheid, which is traumatic, and not have an effect on who we are as people of African descent, okay? And that's where this visceral response is coming in, because people go, here we go again about enslavement. What do you have to say about this topic, brother?
I think that's a good introduction, Smokey, and I would like to add to that condition. For so many years, I believe that it essentially has created a psychological deficit in our personalities, how we respond, and it explains to a large degree much of the behavior that we have titled pathological, which is really an abnormal, normal developmental reaction to these conditions. So I think your introduction is apropos, and it lays the groundwork, I think, for not only intellectual discussion, but an effective or emotional understanding as well.
And we understand that visceral response because, 1865 is when we were supposedly freed, right? And even if you add the other 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, it's still been about, 50 years, 60 years now since the Civil Rights Movement in the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Only yesterday.
And people are acting, want to not think about that past in America. You hear it in white America with the critical race theory trauma that they're going through. Don't want to talk about this thing, but you must talk about it.
Absolutely.
We have to. There is something that distinguishes black people from other groups in America in this time and this space, and we have to deal with this thing because, like you said, there is a psychological issue that we don't even know that we have.
Like most psychological.
Yeah, like most.
Yeah.
You know, unless you could have counseling and know that you have an issue and try to face it, it's not even know that it's part of your personality. Yes. And what we're trying to bring based on this book, and again, everything that we talk about is we read, we study, and along with other things. So this is one of the books that if you want to, do your own research, this is the book that you need to understand more of what we're going to be talking about on this show. Now, before we start our discussion on what's in the book, let's go back basically. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, nor is Brother Williams a medical doctor, but we need to talk about what trauma is, because that's basically the framework that we're talking about. Trauma and its causes, and how it is generational trauma is basically, now there's physical trauma, you break your leg or your sports industry. We're not talking about that, even though that could add to your emotional trauma. Absolutely. We're talking about emotional trauma. So I got a little definitions about trauma. Now, it says here, trauma is a psychological disorder or behavioral state resulting from severe mental or emotional stresses or physical injury. They talk about physical injury. With emotional trauma, something happens that is so utterly terrifying that normal mental processes breaks down. A traumatic experience can also continue to influence how you see the world, how you react to things, and how you also react to yourself. There are men and women from the Vietnam War, as an example, years ago, 50, 60 years ago, who still have nightmares, still break out in cold sweats, still drinking and getting high and to deal with their emotional trauma. Again, there is not a psychologist or psychiatrist or any student of the mind anywhere on this planet who would deny the negative effect of trauma. Okay?
Good definition.
And that's from that perspective what we're talking about. When you have a people, now there's been studies done on the generational effect of Jewish people from World War II, what happened to them and their generational trauma from Buchenwald and Auschwitz and their family members, and they're finding out that yes, even to this day, there are still elements of trauma that is done, even though some of the kids never really experienced that, in the last 20 years, but there's still certain psychological condition responses that happen from something that happened generations ago. If you talk to anybody in Israel, they're still fighting and preparing to be attacked. Okay, I got a list of post-traumatic stress disorder, and I want you to see this first, also, before we go on. Now, look at these symptoms of PTSD. This is what's going on with our soldiers and sailors right to this day that's being dealt with. A feeling of foreshortened future. You mean you ain't gonna live long? How many black boys and girls in 20 or 30 years ago, in the 90s, during the Bloods and Crips, didn't think they were gonna see 20 years old? Okay, it's in us too. An exaggerated startle response, outbursts of anger, difficulty falling and staying asleep, hypervigilance. Anybody had a police car follow them if you're black in America? What do you think you're dealing with? Okay, so these are symptoms of PTSD. Dr. Joyce is saying that you can't have 246 years of enslavement, and I guess enslavement would you consider a traumatic experience daily, Brother Derek?
I think so. As a matter of fact, I would go as far as to say that is our Holocaust.
Thank you.
Okay, depending on how you want to discuss the topic. Whether or not you're familiar with the works by Stamps, The Peculiar Institution, which speaks to the uniqueness of the American slave system and the systems that were put into place to maintain that system are just atrocious. And so the understanding or the sensitivity to that process, I think, is essential to beginning to even understand it and let alone treat it. But like you said, you have to acknowledge it first. And there lies the problem, essentially, is that acknowledgement to do the proper analyses and to see how everything is literally connected.
Very much, not only psychologically, but physically. We're going to talk about certain studies that were done maybe by the second part of this discussion, the next show. But we want you to understand that there is a reason. If nobody talks about it, you think the dominant group always come when it comes to issues of being black in America. Will always come, and I'm not saying it's a negative thing, it's just the way it is. Either you come from a conceptualization, and when you're in your mind and conceptualize, you can't have any kind of, what's the word, feeling of sharing that other group's feelings.
Yes.
You know, there's no empathy. That's the word that I'm trying to use. Okay, so it doesn't. You're not in a rush to learn. You could take it or leave it. Okay.
Yes.
But when it comes to how we are living in America, okay, because there's always two Americas, we are always going to be emotionally attached to our experience here in America.
Absolutely.
So there's going to be a psychological and an emotional response to our history.
Yes,
and certain behavioral patterns that are from that trauma that we are dealing with silently. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, be sorry for black people. The fact that we have survived, that we got doctors, lawyers, and CEOs in a society where we were brought here just to be a permanent working force forever. It wasn't meant for us to be incorporated into the society, brother.
Yeah. Well, I'll add to that from the standpoint, perhaps a little sorrowfulness is what's needed.
I understand.
That would speak to the empathy aspect. But like you said, that's very hard. You relate to those things that you are most familiar with. And so when we get on this topic, we're like, you got the South and the North coming together for some meeting point. It's like, which way is north? And some people pointing north, and others are pointing every direction.
Everywhere, yeah.
Well, if you don't have like you said, the empathy, the sensitivity, then it's very difficult to get into this topic.
Exactly. It's hard. And then just the pure. When we talk about the Holocaust, okay. Either you're going to be interested or not, or you allow the Jewish person, you give them that empathy to respect to talk about it.
Yes.
Okay, the Holocaust victims, or you listen to the Jewish Defense League, or any type, or people from Israel and how their perspective, right? Or when we talk about Native Americans and their issues, studies were done. Okay, studies were done about the Japanese internment. That's a sense of empathy. We want to know how did that affect you? That's the question that's being asked by the society at large.
Yes.
But how come, and that's what Dr. Joy was saying, that every time we talk about enslavement, there is a negative, visceral reaction like, oh, why do you want to bring that up? We don't talk to Jewish people like that. We don't talk to Native Americans like that. We don't talk to the Japanese Americans who were taken out of their homes, and put in internment camp by their own government. But when we talk about this 246-year horror that was enslavement, then on top of that, another 100 years of horror that was an apartheid.
Yes.
We talk about apartheid in the 90s in South Africa, but what do you think they learned it from? This country that has to have the image of the land of the free. And that contradiction is psychological and traumatic, whether you know it or not.
Well, I think one of the important aspects of her work is a question that she asked, which was part of her theory development, is why?
Why that visceral
is there
response?
Such a global in many aspects pushback on this topic of talking
When we
about
bring it up.
slavery.
Exactly.
And I think when you begin to microscopically examine it, you realize because of our participation in that thing called the institution of slavery.
You hit the nail around the head, because when you talk about enslavement, okay, we talk about it as the victims of it, okay? But you got to understand that once you start talking about it, those who are of white or European descent also are going to find out that they also have trauma that they have to deal with when you peel that onion, as you would say, and take out the labor, because it's a double-edged sword.
Absolutely.
Because it not only had it wasn't just a one-way traumatic experience. If you read the letters of slaveholders, if you read the letters of people on plantations, the white people who had the big buildings, they were in constant terror. Because somewhere inside of them, regardless of all the kind of mythologies and rationale and cognitive dissonance that they use to justify hundreds of years of holding on to other human beings that they know was wrong, and then going to church and praying to a God and saying, I'm this good and a person, but you know that you're doing certain things to children and adults, you're going to suffer some type of internal trauma yourself.
You certainly are. And I think it also speaks to fundamental human nature as well. Of things that we participate in, we become accustomed to the conditions of that participation. And so, in other words, when you look at the institution of slavery, we often look at it from a moral standpoint, but we also have to look at it from an economic standpoint.
Yes.
And we can see how economics impacts on behavior. If you can justify making an extra dollar, okay, and so you create a system where you justify it. And so if we made millions and billions off of something and build a foundation off of it,
that's the
and
key
then
point.
Suddenly, we're asked to question that foundation. Not only is there going to be a pushback, but there's going to be a rationalization process where we justify what we've done. And now, that doesn't say much about the foundation of human behavior, but that empathy that you talked about, in order for me to develop that empathy, I have to first of all acknowledge the conditions, look at it, and open myself up to feeling the pain that, or at least imagining what that must have felt like. And so Dr. DeGroy points out one of the other problems is that many people, whites, lack the ability to show that kind of empathy, which reverberates through so many aspects of other systems as well. Because if I look at that, then I'm going to have to look at this. I'm going to have to
expose that onion part.
That systems perspective where each bubble is interconnected. And so we stay away from those bubbles and we justify why those bubbles were created in the first.
And we have these pushbacks, or we have these when you hear like these comments, say when we have a race issue topic that's in the news, why you want to bring that up? Why are you going to do the black card? Those are those type of visceral responses that we are saying. Isn't that we're wrong for bringing it up, because we have a right as any other human being on this planet to express the effects of certain things, but white America still don't want to face the truth that you see, because when you went to school and when I went to school and when as a baby boomer, that was the beginning of this integration stuff where we were with white children. So we got a taste of that kind of white perspective of history, with George Washington and Jefferson and all these heroes we were told as children, okay? But when you grow up and do your research or do your study, you find that from our perspective, black people, they were not heroes.
No.
Okay, no. When you have, like you said, the foundation of everything that you were taught from a child as a white person. And here we are telling you that foundation is based on lies. Yes. How could you say this is the land of the free and the home of the brave, and you got songs and you're waving a red, white, and blue flag, and it symbolizes freedom or you talk about the Declaration of Independence, but the people don't realize the truth of it. That's half the truth. Yeah, Jefferson wrote it, but guess what? In the carriage that he came into Philadelphia on the days he started to write those words, all men are created equal, there was a person in the room with him, his confidant, okay, that was a enslaved person.
Yes.
It was the brother of Sally Hemings.
Yes.
Robert Hemings. What about his freedom?
Yeah.
You see, that contradiction goes against what we're taught, right?
Absolutely, but it's the foundational contradiction that you see in America.
Mm-hmm.
The conversation that we've yet to have, and from a very contemporary perspective, this whole rejection of CRT, this critical race theory.
Yeah.
Well, you know, when you look at science, part of science is being critical in doing any kind of analysis. And so all of a sudden, when we look at social developmental theories, it's void of the same analysis that you see being utilized in science and medicine.
Yeah.
Okay, and so that's the great contradiction, and it's actually painfully humorous that people would reject any theory that allows us to have an intricate understanding as to where it came from and why it's here to begin with.
And like you always have a saying that any new thing requires a little bit of pain, new birth, new ideas, require
psychologically, physically, there's going to be pain because of the newness, the uncomfortableness of it, and the realization of asking a question. You mean I've been lied to? Okay. So we can dignify the lie by creating support systems all around that lie. And that's the great sin, and that's the, until in America, if we don't begin to truthfully
of having this
and accept the pain, all the work requiring pain, what we're seeing today and in the future will continue to repeat itself.
It will not go away.
It will not go away.
You were trained to do counseling, you know, when you were in the military, especially in the area of race relationships. So this brother has experience in the counseling, and anybody, like I said earlier, any student of the mind knows that trauma is generational. Dr. Naeem Akbar, one of the great black side of Frank Cress Wellesley, Dr. Wellesley. These are black scholars who went through the normal system, Stanford and Florida State and Michigan State and all these trained, but they kept their cognition to direct to help their people.
Yes.
There's a reason you might not heard of a bunch of all of them, you know, because they're going to bring that stuff to the surface. So you didn't see them on a lot of TV shows.
Yes.
You see those well-trained psychiatrists or psychologists they bring out today that's pretty much state the status quo and act like slavery had nothing to do with some of the behavioral patterns that we see in our own community.
Yes.
And what I mean is you had to think a certain way to survive.
Yes.
In the way you talk about your children. Say you're a mother and you have a brilliant black child, your enslaved mother in the 1830s, in the depth of enslavement, where your child could be sold. And you don't want to bring attention to that child because it might be profitable to master. So what do? You instinctively, to survive out of love, you develop behavioral patterns that denigrate that child.
Yes.
Not because you hate the child, you love the child, but you want that child to survive, or you want to keep him as long as you can in your care because there's only 7 or 8 or 9 years old.
Absolutely.
But you're afraid, traumatized, to believe that if they see what you see, then that child could be sold for profit.
Yes.
Or you have a pretty daughter. You know she's beautiful. You are beautiful as a black woman. But you know what happened to you when you were 8 or 9, okay?
Yes.
What happened to your mother?
Yes.
The fact that you had light skin, she was a product of what white men brought over from feudal times into America. It's called prima norte. Prima norte, first night. That came out of medieval Europe. And these plantation owners thought themselves the lord of their land. And in prima nota mean that if, say, you marry, I'm a black man, and even though marriage was not legal, but we had our own way of coming together. But before I could lay down with my wife, my newlywed, the master had the right to take her before you. Traumatized. And this went on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yes. And you have to ask the question.
And we're the counselor.
And the question is often asked, how can you do this over and over? Well, one way you can do this is by going back to the rationalization theory and justifying it.
It's all psychological.
They're not human anyway. And we have to understand, human beings like taking a shortcut. And so if I become accustomed to a practice, wealth, whether it's sex, sexual satisfaction, the satiation of our most sexual responses, all of those things that we recognize in human beings, well, not to have a rule or a law and to have free and open access to those things for hundreds of years, you begin to justify it. And so that example that you use about the first night, having access to that, really fed the basic sexual lust of anyone, of men. And so how can I have cherry picking and continue to satisfy or satiate my sexual desire? Well, I can look at them as being beasts anyway.
And
they're
property.
undeserving.
And in property, you can do what you do with your
Right.
cow or your pig. You do whatever you want to
Absolutely.
do. We were classified as property.
Absolutely.
And that feeds that ego you're talking about.
And then on top of that, what you do is once you make that declaration, you build it into a law, the rule of law.
That's where I'm going to go.
And that's where you
over
get slave codes and black codes, where it justifies and legalizes these treatment modalities towards people called
And
Africans.
also, it conditions you psychologically a particular behavioral
Yes, it
pattern.
does.
Because
Yes.
if you by law could do these things, 2 or 3 generations later, doing those same behavioral patterns without the historical knowledge, it is what we always done.
Absolutely.
We got less than 30 seconds. 30 minutes, 30 seconds again before we got to go on to the next show. But we will continue this discussion. You can see why we're talking about trauma, why we're talking about what is important to us as people of African descent. What do you think that slave child or that mother or that father passed on psychologically dealing with that trauma? And but until next time, Brother Williams,
Well said, Smoke.
peace, Hotep, bye-bye.